Okay, can everyone hear me now? Just type in the chat if you can hear me. Type in the chat if you can hear me. It should be showing up now. I'm getting sort of, it says for me that the microphone is working, so let's just make sure. I'm not going to start with anything until people confirm this to me. It's working?
Use Hellman's light. We care about making...
The sound is working. Okay. Amazing. Hi everyone, I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties on this, just trying to get the microphone working. It seems like there are a few issues with that, but we're going to get off to a delayed start. Sorry for everyone who's been here for about 20 minutes. So before we get started with anything, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to myself. My name is Sunaina Danziger. I'm directing Dissect this year at HMUN India. I am originally from New York City, although I'm currently in London, where I'm working at the UK Parliament. And I study history at Harvard. I'm most interested in modern international history and causes of war. I also am getting a secondary in Spanish, and I take a lot of English classes in addition to that. Outside of anything related to Model UN, I enjoy writing. I do a lot of political and some satirical writing, and I do a lot of running and reading for pleasure. Just a bit of background on information on myself. My entire mom's side of the family is from India, hence the sort of Indian first name and non-Indian last name. So based in Delhi, so I've spent a lot of time in India over the course of my lifetime, and I'm really excited to go to HMUN India for the first time. So before we get started on the actual substantive aspects of this webinar, I just wanted to give a couple of general announcements just related to HMUN in general. So the first is that position papers need to be submitted on Monbase, and that these are incredibly important just in terms of your participation in committee. You will be disqualified from awards, for instance, if we do not have a position paper, and it really just demonstrates your dedication to the committee, to your directors. And it's a very important way of basically solidifying your research and your preparation for committee. So that's the first series of general announcements. The second is that if you have any questions about any substantive matters, you should be emailing your directors. So those emails are listed on the website. Mine, for instance, is dissect@hmunindia.org. Those for other committees should be fairly similar. And then the third thing I want to just make a general announcement about is background guides. I think any sort of pre-committee preparation is really important, but the most basic pre-committee preparation that you can do is reading your background guides. So if for whatever reason you're unable to access these background guides, or you don't have the password or any such thing, you should either email your directors, so again, their emails are listed on the website, or you should email info@hmunindia.org. Okay, excellent. So those are the general announcements that I've made. I'm just going to sort of briefly go over how I plan to structure this webinar. So I'm going to go over a brief run-through of things that I think are important in terms of writing working papers and draft resolutions. While I'm giving that kind of general run-through, you should be sort of, if you have any questions that come up, ask those questions using the chat function, and I won't necessarily stop the general run-through to answer those questions, but I will answer those questions after I'm done with the general run-through. So, fantastic. So, general run-through will start now, and the first thing that I'm going to talk about is pre-conference preparation and how you should be focusing pre-conference preparation on working papers and draft resolutions, and how pre-conference preparation will prepare you for writing each of those things in committee. So, the first thing, as I already said, is to read the background guide and focus on the questions a resolution must answer. So, directors structured background guides essentially such that they would give you both a general overview of the history of your topic, the current situation related to your topic, but also orienting it towards their specific committee expectations and how they want you to go about, coming up with solutions for the topic. So I think definitely getting a sense of annotating your director's background guide and getting a sense of exactly what they want you to get out of it from a solutions-based standpoint is the most important thing you can do in terms of just the foundation of your research. So that should be one of the most important things that you do before you do any other pre-conference preparation focused on writing working papers and draft resolutions, is to think about the background guide and what your director wants you to get out of it from that standpoint. So again, thinking in a very solutions-based way, looking at the proposed solutions that they provided, the history of UN action, so past UN action, and how you can really sort of use that as a baseline for developing your own ideas, which you will eventually incorporate within a draft resolution or working paper. So that's the first important thing. And then one thing that you should be, this basically your background guide will guide you as you're going forward and as you're thinking about future research, so research you can do beyond the background guide, and your directors provided a lot of sort of helpful guidelines, committee-specific guidelines for suggestions for further research in the background guide. And so I definitely use that as the second point and think then again about how your country's policy aligns with potential solutions and really gear your research not at coming up with sort of as much factual information regarding the topic as possible, but thinking about how you can come up with necessary solutions. So again, thinking in a very solutions-based way as you begin your preliminary research. So a couple of things that can help you with that. So I often find that as I'm conducting research and I'm thinking about how I'm eventually going to be writing a working paper or a draft resolution, it's really helpful to think about reports that NGOs have published or past UN resolutions, basically very actionable framework style papers that you can read to get a sense of actionable things that people are doing related to your topic. So this is not, again, just reading background information, but this is reading sort of action plans, what NGOs have accomplished in the past, what was lacking essentially in that NGO work beforehand. And so reading these really in-depth reports, often they tend to be sort of, there are a lot of reports that get published that are 60 pages long or in excess of 60 pages long. So these have a lot of really meaty information that you can get out in terms of solutions. And so those are really helpful things to look at as you're, again, thinking about basically like any sort of pre-conference preparation. So a bit of a note on pre-conference preparation. HMUN has a very seriously enforced pre-grading and plagiarism policy. So although you ought to use any of these materials as a reference point, at no point are you allowed to attempt to basically construe those ideas as your own, or are you allowed to present their ideas word by word without attributing it to them. So again, these are helpful in terms of kind of a guiding you towards your own ideas and giving you a sense of basically other solutions-based things that experts or think tanks have done in the past, but at no point should you be construing those ideas as your own. And I've talked a lot about how your research should really be based around solutions, although at no point are you really allowed to write any solutions down in a way that resembles what is called clause format, which several of you probably know about. I'll go into in more detail soon. And at no point should it be in any form that very closely resembles clause format. And so this is something that, as someone who's directed many times, I've also participated many times, I'm able to pick up on this, and all of our directors are able to pick up on this fairly easily. So as you should be reading basically as many of these reports as possible, and they should be really helpful, but at no point should you be writing something that very seriously resembles or is a working paper or a draft resolution. So with that, I'm going to quickly get into the distinction between working papers and draft resolutions. So I know this is often an HMUN specific thing, but working papers are essentially the first draft of a draft resolution. So I know that that's a little bit difficult because obviously draft resolution sounds like the draft, but working papers come before draft resolutions. So basically how the timeline for that will work is you will start on Thursday night basically coalescing into what are called blocks, which you will basically be defined by, depending on the committee, similarities in policy or similarities in solutions that you might have, but these should definitely be politically defined as opposed to arbitrarily defined. And working papers with your initial block are sort of things that you will write collectively and collaboratively with your initial block, and they generally start, that kind of, the bulk of that work starts happening on Friday during the Friday sessions, and depending at your director's discretion, you will probably submit working papers at some point on Friday. And so unlike draft resolutions, I've mentioned this thing called clause format, which some of you, again, probably know about already before, but working papers can take clause format. They often are in clause format, but they don't have to be in clause format. So these are intended to be a kind of rough assembly of ideas per se. So the sort of collective document that your block of countries has written and presented to the committee. So although these are presented to the committee and the committee will then read these documents, they are not voted on and they are not official documents because they need not be in clause format. Draft resolutions are basically the next stage of working papers. These have to be in clause format. We actually take it very seriously, and we think often your directors will approach you if there are any issues with clause format or grammar. And these are essentially after your initial working papers have been debated, you've incorporated the ideas and criticisms of your committee, you've often gone through this process of merging, which we'll discuss more in a little bit, and these are basically the finalized version that you will submit. There are far fewer of them because, again, the working papers have sort of been merged together, and these always take clause format. So these are the ones that are presented to the committee that are often, that have amendments to them and that are eventually voted upon probably during the end of Saturday session. If not, sometimes they're voted on Sunday. So that's just a general overview of the kind of schedule for and the difference between working papers and draft resolutions. I'm now going to go, and again, if you have any questions, because that is definitely going to be what I want the bulk of this webinar to be, please, anything that comes to mind at any point, ask those questions in the chat tab, and again, I will get to them as soon as I'm finished with the run-through. Also, just make sure that just let me know if my pace is okay, if you need me to clarify anything, or if there's still any technical difficulties. Use that all in the chat function. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to go through clause format a little bit. So, again, working papers very frequently take this form, but they don't always take this form. But draft resolutions will always take this form, so this is something that you should definitely know. I'm going to be talking from a general assembly perspective because obviously I think in committees that are more specialized, or the ECOSOC committees, or the Security Council, this is slightly different. There should be it's mostly similar between the ECOSOCs and the General Assemblies, but I'm going to address it from a mostly, as if, for example, we were in DISAC, which is the committee that I'm directing. So the first general thing to bear in mind with working papers and draft resolutions is that the General Assembly and the ECOSOC can only ever advise action. We're not the Security Council. There's nothing that can be actionable about what we're doing, and so our language has to essentially reflect that fact. And so instead of using words like declare or direct or forcible action, actionable words, we have to use words like calls for or recommends. So these are examples of words that you can use when you're sort of attempting to guide the international community to take certain courses of action. So that is basically, it's the advisory. The General Assembly was established as sort of one nation, one vote. Basically, every country was there, but the whole point of that was that there was nothing that the General Assembly, for better or for worse, could actually force the international community to take on. So essentially, the language of your draft resolutions will reflect that. So the way that these draft resolutions in terms of clause format are structured is that you generally will have a signatories list. So the signatories, there are no sponsors at HMUN, in HMUN in general. That's just a general HMUN rule. I know that at a lot of other conferences there are divisions between those who actually contributed to the working paper or draft resolution, and those would be sponsors, and then signatories, people who just sort of want to see it debated and signed on. So at HMUN there's no distinction. There are just signatories. So signatories can vary from the people who contributed the most to a draft resolution or working paper to people who just want to see it debated. So the first thing that appears on any sort of draft resolution or working paper is the list of signatories. And I know that sometimes also there's confusion over whether there need to be signatories for working papers. I think that is at generally the director's discretion, but normally I would say there are, for the sake of clarity, signatories on working papers too. And your directors will decide the number that is necessary per committee, depending on the size of the committee. So what comes after that is, it's a little bit official, but you need sort of a line that basically says the General Assembly, and you underline that. So that is saying, basically, that this is what the General Assembly has called for, or let's say the first committee of the General Assembly, and that is always underlined just as a point of formality. And the next thing that comes after that, so the actual getting into the substantive aspects of this, you have preambulatory clauses. So preambs, the way I like to think of preambs it's basically everything you want the international community to know before you actually get into the substance of the resolution. So things to bear in mind, things to recognize, things to be cognizant of. These are all words that you could use. And preambs are all essentially gerunds. So what that means is that they're basically verbs that end in ing. So like recognizing, cognizant of, or bearing in mind. So it's rather than bear in mind, it would be bearing in mind. It would not be recognized, but recognizing. So these are things that essentially, this is a great place for you to make reference to research that you've done. So if there are any previous, essentially General Assembly resolutions, Security Council resolutions, work that NGOs have done, you can always make reference to that in your preambulatory clauses. That is definitely what I would recommend. So things that you're not specifically and personally doing, but things that you are acknowledging before going actually into the meat and substance of your draft resolution. So although preambs are important and they're necessary, I would not say they're that important. I think the thing that you really should be focusing on is the meat of the resolution, is the operative clauses. So I'm going to get a little bit more into that. Just another note of formality, all preambs have to be italicized, that's kind of just how it works. And then operative clauses are always underlined, so that is another distinction. So now let's get into operative clauses. So you've laid out basically in your preambulatory clauses what you think the committee should know before reading the actual resolution, and now you get into the operative clauses, and this is what you want the committee, or you want the international community to do, what the committee has decided the international community needs to do going forward. So these are the solutions. So as opposed to in preambs, with operative clauses you can use more they are not gerunds, so they don't end in ing. It's mostly just so a lot of phrases that I like to use are calls upon, recognizes, recommends, I'm trying to think of other ones, affirms. So basically not very affirmative, sort of assertive language that says like declares or ensures or guarantees, which are things that the Security Council can do, but they're more actionable, basically verbs. So these are always underlined and they're numbered. And I'm going to get into a little bit about how that is structured just generally before I get into actually the meat and substance of how you go about writing them. So every operative clause is numbered and every operative clause ends with a semicolon. So that's fundamentally sort of the most basic thing that you can do is that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of just how that is structured. But say, like, you want to, a very fundamental clause can be sort of recommends funding for recommends the committee adopt the framework provided by the UNDP's thematic trust fund on women and girls, for instance. So then that would end with a semicolon. So that is a very fundamental, like a very basic clause. There are no subclauses. It's just basically a sentence, except not technically a sentence, but then ending with a semicolon, and then you would go on to the next number, essentially. But most clauses should have much more detail to them, and so that's where you get subclauses. So the way subclauses work are, I'm going to see if I can find you a good example of this, but the way subclauses work is that they provide basically more detail on your original clauses. So, for example, you could say calls for the. I'm going to give an example about peacekeeping in Syria, for instance. So here's an example clause: calls for the reinstatement of the United Nations Supervision Mission in Syria, which will work collaboratively under the structures of the Arab League and under strict operational framework in order to, then you would use a colon, and then the next subclause, the first subclause would be A. And so then you would say A, encourage the implementation of the Security Council and Joint Envoy 6-point proposal, which functions under the following guidelines. Then you would do another colon, and then you would say Roman numeral 1, to oversee an effective and inclusive Syrian-led political process to address the legitimate aspirations and concerns of the Syrian people, then another comma, And then Roman numeral 2, to facilitate a cessation of armed violence in all forms and by all parties. Then you do another comma, and so say those are the only 2 points that you want to come across. Then you go back out and you go to your sort of your second preliminary, your second first subclause, if that makes sense. And then you would say B. And so B function under an explicit framework for humanitarian intervention, which would include the following provisions. Then again, you would go into Roman numeral 1 and then Roman numeral 2. And then when you finally end that clause, like you did with clauses that did not have any subclauses, you would end that with a semicolon. So a couple of takeaways from that. You are ending all subclauses with commas unless you are going into further subclauses. So if you're going into further subclauses, then you can use a colon to indicate that you're moving sort of in one direction. So if that makes sense, like think of it as the further out you are, the sort of fewer subclauses that you're in, and the further in you are, the sort of further in you are in terms of subclauses. And so the order for that is all clauses, all sort of basic clauses are organized by number. Then your first subclauses are organized by lowercase letters, so A, B, C, D, E, etc. Then your next level are Roman numerals, and so that would be, like I, double I, V, etc. And then if you want to go even further, then you would go back to numbers, and then you would go to capital letters. So sometimes you will end up going that far, oftentimes you won't, and that is basically how that is structured. An important point about subclauses, you can never have just one subclause. If you're going to have just one subclause, then you might as well make it just not a subclause, make that part of the original clause. So if there is an A, there always has to be a B. If there's a Roman numeral 1, there always has to be a Roman numeral 2. Otherwise, it cannot be a subclause, and that's just how those function. So I hope that makes sense. Again, ask any questions. I see people are asking some questions, which I promise you I will get to. So an important thing about actually the substance of writing working papers and draft resolutions is, again, to use the foundation of the research that you conducted before the committee and before the conference. So thinking about actionable policies and not just sort of using the background information that you provided, sort of like the history and things that have worked in the past, things that haven't, and then adapting those structures. So creativity here is really important. I think directors are able to identify what are original ideas and what are non-original ideas, what are sort of taking existing frameworks and which resolutions are actually adapting those frameworks. So I think that extra step of actually adding something new to what you're doing is very important. So that's one point that I would take to it. So take background knowledge and apply it. And then second really, really, really important point that directors are always picking up on is this something that's actually feasible? Is this something that the International Committee could actually feasibly put into action? And the way to make sure that that's possible is to provide as much detail as possible. So I know that oftentimes it's very easy and it's fun to sort of say, like, oh, we're going to save the world, let's establish a peacekeeping program, and it's going to function perfectly in Syria, because of course the Syrian government is entirely, willing to accept that type of thing. Obviously that's not something that works in real life, and often I think it's very difficult in Model UN to recognize that, try to make something as realistic as possible, even though it is modeling the United Nations. And so the way to do that is to provide as much detail as possible, and that's why resolutions that have, or clauses that have a lot of subclauses are often going to be the most effective. And so often, even if, for example, they don't necessarily get as much, essentially, sort of, they're not as popular among the committee, directors are definitely going to pick up on the resolutions that are most substantive and that are most detailed. So things to think about for that is not just what you want to happen, but how that is going to happen, who is going to carry out what you want to happen, on what timeline, with which actors involved, under which circumstances, in which circumstances is that not possible. So these are all things that you should be bearing in mind. These are all things that obviously the international community has to think about when going about structuring anything. And so as much detail as you can provide, the more detail that you can provide, essentially, the better, and the more you're actually going to be sort of capable of carrying out something that you recommend, and that the more that you are actually going to be applying any background information that you have. So the next point that I'm going to make is about, I know I touched on this at the very beginning of this webinar, but plagiarism and citing sources. So I know that a lot of people have questions about how exactly you are going to be doing this. So there's no official guide. There's no sort of, you're not expected to use MLA or Chicago citations or anything along those lines, but you are expected to make reference to anything that you are citing. For instance, I made reference to the UNDP's thematic trust fund they have a lot of thematic trust funds, so let's say for XYZ. So if you are using that framework that has been provided to you by the UNDP, you have to make reference to it. So it's not something that you're creating and you cannot assign another name to it. You have to refer to it as one of the UNDP's thematic trust funds and then go with it from there. So, for example, acting under the auspices of the UNDP is a good way of saying that, or following the let's see, like the Carter Foundation is something that does a lot in terms of facilitating peace processes. So like using the Carter Foundation's guidelines for XYZ. So although you do not have to explicitly or in any way sort of formally cite anything, you are absolutely 100% expected to reference and explicitly in writing anything that you are taking. So if you're taking anyone else's ideas, you should make reference to those. So oftentimes, and we have technology that actually picks up on this, so this is not something that we were taking lightly by any means. If we do see that you are taking something from a document that already exists, or we do see that you are using a framework that already exists, as long as you make reference to it, that is totally fine. If you don't make reference to it and you're basically sort of playing it off as though it's sort of your original idea, then that is very problematic, and that is something that you can run into a lot of issues with. And because we take plagiarism very seriously and we don't want to reward people who don't actually follow HMUN's rules, that could lead from your being disqualified, essentially. So be very, very careful about that. And that comes in any form. I know that someone just asked if these had to be added to working papers and draft resolutions. So it's not footnotes. It is basically just informally making reference to, but informally but explicitly making reference to where you got something from. I think that is the way to think about that. So the next point that I'm going to make is to use the questions a resolution must answer as a guide. They are questions a resolution must answer for a reason, and that's because your directors are expecting every single draft resolution that gets presented to effectively answer each of those questions. So I would definitely suggest, as you're writing working papers and draft resolutions with your people in your blocks, you have to bear in mind basically what is happening and sort of like make sure that you are actually answering all of those questions, because if you don't, then your resolution or your draft resolution is likely to be much less effective. And then this is always especially important for committees that have a case study element. I'm going to use my committee as an example. So in my committee, the topic itself sounds very broad. It's, military intervention in transnational conflict. What does that mean exactly? But the specific case study that I'm using to basically push that forward and to make sure that that is grounded, that something that large with that many sort of very large theoretical ideas at play is actually being applied, is the current situation in the Middle East with the Islamic State and with the Syrian civil war, the spill-out conflict that includes, and basically the effect that has in terms of transnational conflict with non-state actors involved, with Western powers involved, with Russia involved, using it as a proxy war. So all of those ideas that are sort of can be broadly clumped under the sort of general topic of military intervention in transnational conflict are basically coalesce into this one specific case study. And so a note that I will make about that is that all draft resolutions in those types of committees have to, again, at the discretion of your director, who will make this very clear, have to equally address some of the broad themes, and oftentimes more of an emphasis, I would say, on the case studies. So make sure you are reading the background guide to get a sense of what your director wants in terms of that ratio. Great. So I'm quickly just going to get into, I know I discussed the general schedule of how working papers versus draft resolutions worked, but I wanted to do this in a little bit more detail. So unmods, or unmoderated caucuses, are very important in terms of sort of how working papers and then draft resolutions get written. To give a brief overview of how that will work on in terms of the schedule, I would say on Thursday you are not expected to do any writing. Actually, you're very discouraged from doing any writing. You should be basically getting a sense of other countries who share your similar policies. And again, we want this to be very contentious. We don't want you to align with countries that you have no policy commonalities with. Even if your resolutions don't get passed or have no hope of getting passed, stick to your policies. So that is what you're going to be doing on Thursday. You're going to begin to sort of meet with like-minded countries, people who you're hearing giving speeches who are saying things that are interesting to you, and then using that to help build your blocks, essentially. So once you've done that on Thursday, you'll start basically thinking about writing working papers going into Friday. And then on Friday we can essentially call working paper day. You're essentially exclusively focused on working papers. And so your job on Friday will be about collaborating, and this is really important. No one country should be writing an entire draft resolution, or excuse me, an entire working paper. It should really be a collaborative process with the countries that you're working with, collaboratively contributing to a working paper. So those countries should each contribute clauses based on their individual research, their policies, their background, and this should not be done arbitrarily. You should think about an equitable and also just generally effective in a way that makes most sense, I would say, to sort of divvy out the writing in terms of who gets to write what based on what their policies are. But definitely, it should be very obvious to directors that this was not just the work of one country or one individual, but the work of really the collective bloc, which is representing a unified position. And it should be very clear that that is the case to directors. And what I would say about that is, as writing becomes basically, as sort of into Friday, I would say a lot of people end up outside of the committee room writing. So in a double delegation committee, so DISEC, for instance, is a double delegation committee. What I would say my policy is for that is that at least one delegate should be in the room the entire time. And so if one of the delegates is outside writing, there has to be at least one representative from that country in the committee room at an entire time. There are a lot of General Assembly committees that are single del committees, in which case I would say you should essentially divvy up the amount of time that some of you are spending, as in certain members of your bloc are spending outside or spending inside, just so it's very obvious that you're not missing key aspects of debate, because it is important to definitely continue giving speeches, to continue listening to the formal aspects of debate. And another just point about, I've mentioned this a lot already, but how blocks should really be, and working papers should really be divided by policy and not arbitrarily. Between the working paper and the draft resolution process, if directors do see that they are divided fairly arbitrarily, and that countries that should not be working together are working together, and countries that should be working together are not working together, directors will intervene fairly actively to make sure that that is not the case in the draft resolution stage. So what I would say is, make sure that you are doing that fairly early on, and that as you are going about making blocks, you are thinking really sort of very strongly about your policies and your sort of similarities in terms of policies and solutions. So how do you go from the working paper stage to the draft resolution stage? So a massive portion of this is a process called merging. So similar working papers, or working papers that are representing or reflecting similar policies, or are able to basically compromise on that, the director will often facilitate this, but they should be merged together. So while you might go from anywhere between 6 to 8, I would say, working papers, there will probably be 2 to 3 draft resolutions, and no more than that at your director's discretion, but that's generally what it is. And so you will basically use the time between the end of Friday, where you have basically somewhat in a kind of, oftentimes in an abridged way, presented your working papers and the committee has read them. You will then begin the process of merging your working papers together into draft resolutions. So that is what will happen then, and then you have basically directors will facilitate this to make sure that it works as well as possible, but you will have then draft resolutions that are about sort of half as many draft resolutions on going into Saturday. Then draft resolutions are formally presented in a process that's called a Q&A session. So the way that a Q&A session will work is that the sort of general rules of parliamentary procedure no longer apply, and you are basically at your director's discretion both giving some sort of general, there might be sort of a reading period for people to read through draft resolutions, and then you might summarize some of your draft resolutions, and you're basically open to answer questions from other delegates. And what should be very obvious during these Q&A sessions is that it has that sort of these process, the writing process for the draft resolutions was equitable, that you really collaborated to form the documents, and that basically everyone has a general sense of what's in the draft resolution. So the Q&A session is a good way to basically defend your own draft resolution before you get into actually sort of more substantive policy debate, and to make sure that you are actually sort of capable of doing that. And it's really sort of a really great way to demonstrate to the director which countries have been actually sort of actively contributing to the writing process. So that's basically all that I have in terms of the run-through. So I see that a lot of you have answered questions, so I'm going to go back and basically in order, the order that they were basically asked, I'm going to answer these questions. Keep them going. I really want to answer as many questions as possible, and I think this is a really good way to go about it. So, will all working papers be accepted and or discussed in committees? So, to answer that question, no, not all. I think up to your director's discretion, there has to be a minimum number of signatories on each working paper, and so say the director puts a very firm cap on the number of working papers that are going to be submitted. What I would say is, say that cap is 7, and then the director receives 8 working papers. And then the director, he or she, sees that some of the working papers have sufficient signatories, some of them don't, some of them are very, very similar in terms of policy. Then rather than say, oh, you submitted this too late, all of these were already submitted, that's not going to happen. Basically, anyone's ideas are going to be represented, but then the director will probably do is ask certain countries to merge, or certain working papers to merge, and if any working papers have an insufficient number of signatories, then they will be merged with other working papers that will give them sufficient number of signatories. So that is the way that all of them will be accepted and discussed. I think the only caveat to that is if there are any working papers that are completely inappropriate or plagiarized or any of those things, then I think at the chair's discretion again, they might not be discussed. But I would say HMUN is not trying to limit the perspectives of anyone. I think it's just for efficiency's purposes and for basically the purpose of making committee run as smoothly as possible. There have to be caps. So that is how caps work. Then you also ask, since each country in the DISEC committee has 2 delegates, will different working papers and draft resolutions be accepted from each of them, or are they required to collaborate? So in any committee, DISEC is one example of them, but in any committee where 2 people are representing one country, those 2 people are from the same school, so yes, you were representing a similar policy. You're not allowed to split up in terms of each double delegate, sort of each pair of the double delegation is not allowed to work with different people. You were working as a singular unit. So, as I said before, one of you can be outside, one of you can be speaking to other countries while the other person is writing or speaking, etc. But you are acting as sort of one unified front. Then, will there be any sort of crisis updates in the committee? So yes, I think that's definitely something that I like to do, but I think a general HMUN policy is that I know in a lot of other General Assembly committees, it's often difficult to incorporate a crisis element because you're so focused on writing, but I think your directors are definitely going to try to push you to basically adapt your ideas as much as possible and to be as sort of aware of potential changes or potential pitfalls with your working papers. And so I would say definitely thinking between the working paper and draft resolution stage, there will be some sort of update, I would say, that is going to compel you to change a few things around. So yes, there are crisis elements. You're not going to be necessarily responding to crisis elements as you would in a crisis committee, so there are no crisis notes and there are no directives most of the time. So it often will be sort of ideas that will be incorporated then into your draft resolutions. Then, okay, so next question is, do preambulatory clauses end with semicolons as well? That's actually a very good question. I didn't actually address that point. No, preambulatory clauses are divided by commas. So a good way to think about the entire actually resolution writing process is that the entire document, it could be 10 pages long, it could be 3 pages long, whatever it is, but the whole thing is a sentence. And it's funny to think about that, but the whole thing is a sentence. The whole thing, the very last clause will always end with a period. All operative clauses end with semicolons. All subclauses of operative clauses end with commas, unless they're going further in again, where they end with colons. to indicate that you're going sort of into more subclauses, or another level of subclauses, rather. But all preambulatory clauses end with commas, and there are no subclauses to preambulatory clauses. It's just a very basic, simple statement. Just quickly, yes, this video will be uploaded on YouTube after, because it is recorded. And so I am not entirely sure I understand this question, but will all the subclauses have preambulatory clauses? So again, I'm going to just make a distinction between what preambulatory clauses are and what subclauses are. Preambulatory clauses never have subclauses. They come before the actual actionable meat of your resolution. They are basically just things to bear in mind before you actually talk about what you want to do. So things to bear in mind before the actual solutions come into play. Operative clauses have subclauses, and these are the ones that are kind of first A, B, C, D, E, then Roman numerals, then again back to numbers, then capital letters. So that's the distinction between preambs and subclauses. The only similarity is that both of them end with commas. So do all subclauses end with a comma or a colon? So yes, unless it's ending the entire clause. If it's ending the entire clause, then it ends with a semicolon. If it is just a normal subclause and it ends with a comma. If it is a subclause or part of the clause that is moving into another set of subclauses, then it ends with a colon. So again, often a phrase that is very helpful to use is including but not limited to, if you want to describe in detail policies that you're trying to represent. And so in that case, you would say including but not limited to, then colon, then you would go into A, then the first thing you're including but not limited to, comma, then B, then the second thing you're including but not limited, then that ends with a comma, and then C. Third thing, say there are more details to that third thing. Then you do another colon, then you go into another set of subclauses, and you'd say sort of Roman numeral 1 would be the first detail, Roman numeral 2 would be the second detail, Roman numeral 3 would be the third detail. Say that's it for those. And you'd end with that with a comma. Then you'd go back to D. Then you'd say whatever the last thing you want to include is, then D. And then you will end with a semicolon, and that will be the end of your clause. So I hope that makes sense. You can, of course, keep going with E and say E, you want more subclauses, and you can go back into Roman numerals, but again, you have to sort of distinguish between those with colons. So yes, essentially all subclauses will end with either a comma, a colon, or if it's the very end of the clause, then it's a semicolon. Can we make references from, what is the requirement of a working paper? I think I discussed this just a little bit. It doesn't have to be in clause form. Oftentimes it does take clause form. Sometimes it's more helpful for it to take clause form. Basically, the requirements of a working paper is just that there are a set of countries that have worked on them. At the chair's discretion, oftentimes chairs will kind of have different policies on these, but they're basically very informal, and they are presenting a series of ideas represented by a certain block to a committee, or to the committee, rather. Can we make references from the background guide? Yes, absolutely, you totally should. I think the background guide is also cited, so the background guide is cited using citations, so if there's anything that I'm making reference to in the background guide that is taken from somewhere else, I think it's always helpful to reference that, unless it's sort of general information and general knowledge that you think. Because it's in the background guide, the committee probably knows this, and so I'm just going to make reference to it, but I definitely think it certainly makes me happy to know that people have read something that I worked very hard on, and especially as someone who loves history, we'll say this just for any dissect people who are out there, definitely make historical references. I will be very happy. So yes, you can absolutely cite the background guide. Next question is, in the position paper, do we focus on the country's past policies and what has been done by them, or include original ideas? So each committee has a somewhat different policy on position papers, I would say. Generally, how they are divided at HMUN, I know this is sometimes different at other conferences, but how they're divided at HMUN, and this is how they're working for DISEC also, is the first is basically a kind of your country's experience with the topic, so not necessarily its policy or its historical policy, but its experience with the topic. The second paragraph will be the country's policy on a topic, and so that collectively will be about half of the position paper. And then the remaining half of the position paper should be your original ideas, going off of sort of using that as a baseline, and then your original ideas presented in that third paragraph. And I might say my guideline in terms of word limit, or word count rather, for that is aim for around 750 words for the entire thing. And so think about, like, half of that. So the solution paragraph should be probably 375 words, something along those lines. Okay, so will there be a process for press releases or chits for that matter? So no, they're not really. So because it's a General Assembly committee and not a crisis committee, the main forms of writing the only really forms of writing that you're going to submit are working papers and draft resolutions. So even though there might be crisis updates, there won't really be sort of a way of directly responding to that besides incorporating it within your revised draft resolution or revised working paper or writing amendments or that type of thing. Or say, often the director will use crisis elements to basically, if countries are not on policy, to push those countries towards the policies that they're supposed to be having. But this should definitely be based around draft resolutions and working papers as opposed to anything sort of that you might see in crisis committees. So will I be the only person representing my country in my committee? So that really depends on which committee you are on. As I said again, I'm not entirely sure which committees are double dels and which are single dels. If you are not sure if you are the only person representing your country on your committee, then you should email info@hmunindia.org. Although what I would say is, if you think you're the only person who's representing your country on your committee, then you probably are, because if they're in any sort of double delegation, the two people who are representing the same country will be from the same school. So that should not be too much of an issue. So again, answering that question, which all committees are double delegation, I'm not entirely sure offhand. I know that my committee is, but some of them are and some of them are not. I think some if not all of the EcoSocs are, is what I would say. But again, if you are not sure about that for whatever reason, then you should email info@hmunindia.org. So what's the general format of the main content of the working papers and draft resolutions? So first, actually, before I get to that, yes, DISEC is a double delegation committee, and then what's the general format of the main content of the working papers and draft resolutions? So I think I've gotten into this in a fair amount of detail, but I think, again, clause format and the main content. For working papers, I'd say I'd recommend it being clause format because it's much easier then to transition from the working paper stage to the draft resolution stage, although they do not explicitly have to be in clause format. But again, draft resolutions, the substance, the meat of the draft resolutions have to be structured as a series of first preambulatory clauses and then operative clauses, and using that kind of funky format that I described. Again, if you don't remember everything that I've said, there is a guide for writing working papers and draft resolutions that should be on the HMUN India website under conference preparation, sort of pre-conference materials. And so if you want to sort of visually see how this works, definitely look at that. Look at any resolutions that are available online on the UN website. Those are helpful in terms of giving you a sense of how clause format actually looks in practice. Because I know when I'm talking about it, I'm sort of talking about semicolons and commas and colons and whatnot. I know it can get in Roman numerals, and when to use them and when not to, it can get confusing. But I think big recommendation is definitely to look at actually what these documents look like. Oftentimes, it might even be easier to look at what previous Model UN resolutions look like, because obviously Model UN and the real UN are not quite the same, although we might hope and aspire to strive for them to be the same. Okay, so then how do you know your committee? Your committees should have been emailed to you, sort of basically either to your sort of head delegates or to your faculty advisors, and they're also available through login on Monbase. Again, that is the information that I have been given. If you have any specific questions and you haven't, for whatever reason, received your assignments, you should definitely email info@hmunindia.org, because you should definitely know those by now. So who will let us know? Again, email info@hmunindia.org. When in doubt, that is Jing, who is our USG admin, will be able to answer any specific questions related to that. Great question. So, do the working papers have to be written before the conference? So under no circumstance should anything be written before the conference. That constitutes pre-writing, and pre-writing is not allowed because we consider the working papers and draft resolutions to be a collaborative process based around debate that has taken place in the committees. And so by writing something beforehand, you're basically not abiding by the rule that they're supposed to be collaborative, and you're not you definitely did not listen to any debate before going in. So I know that this is sometimes different on the non-HMUN style MUNs, where you sort of go in with writing. The only writing that you do before going into committee is your position paper, and so obviously that's not formal. But you should certainly not write anything before conference that resembles clause format in any way, or that resembles a resolution in any way. Even you could be very fancy and have a series of bullet points that can be very easily translated into a resolution. You're not allowed to do that. That counts as pre-writing. So, as part of DISEC, can our resolutions direct financial actions or policies? Yeah, this is a DISEC question, but it's also a general question. Yes, they can. This is something that I meant to touch upon, but funding is definitely something that you want to address in any draft resolutions or working papers. It's important in terms of detail, and it's important in terms of making your working paper or draft resolution actually actionable. So yes, you can make reference to them. Often what I find easier is to kind of use the foundations that have been provided to you by them. So even though DISEC is technically sort of handles matters related to disarmament and international security, and so it's not necessarily directly overseeing anything in the financial sort of, like ECOFIN, the Economic and Financial Committee would do that. But what I would say is you should definitely make reference to those, because it makes your resolution more actionable. So yes. So do you have to mention the countries which have contributed to the working papers? Yes, as I said again earlier, there is no distinction at HMUN between sponsors and signatories, so I know that at a lot of other conferences, the delegates who actually contributed to the writing process are called sponsors, and people who just want to see it debated are called signatories, and they might not agree with everything, but they want to see it debated. But yes, generally working papers have signatories. I like all working papers to have signatories, and it's probably going to be sort of a proportional number to the number of working papers versus the number of people in the committee. So just think about that. So say there are 8 working papers, I would say there should probably be 12 signatories or something along those lines in a committee that has 195 countries represented. So are there any position papers we can look at to just get a good idea of it? So I would say I think there are actually examples of position papers in the pre-conference handbook. I'm not positive about this, but yes, I would say the best way to go about it is, if you don't have sort of position papers that other people, or sort of people who have participated before, can provide you from your school, I would say use the internet, find as many as possible. I know it's definitely different from an HMUN standpoint, but I think I'm fairly positive that the pre-conference handbook has actually some sort of example of a position paper. So I'm sorry that I can't be slightly more helpful on that, but again, I think just following the guidelines for them, and you should be fairly good. Sorry. I'm just going to go back. Do all the signatories in the working papers have to specify their country's policies? No, they do not. They should. The way that you're basically going to talk about how you contributed to draft resolutions and working papers is through speeches, and is through the question and answer sessions. So it does not have to be formally in writing. Likewise, yeah, so you like if there are 12 countries, do all countries have to specify their country policy? They do not. This is something that you should talk about, but essentially the idea is anyone who is sort of definitely supporting a draft resolution or a working paper should be able to speak about the draft resolution or working paper as a collective, as a whole. So make reference to their specific points that they contributed and to their policy, but ideally what happens is then the entire thing ends up representing, to an extent, the entire unified front of a block. Okay, so let's see, more questions. Is a single representative in a double delegation disadvantageous? So I think it can be a little bit more difficult. I think that's definitely something that if you are a single delegate in a double delegation committee, then I think the director is very aware that you are at somewhat of a disadvantage in the sense that you can't have one representative out and one representative in, and you can't really divvy up tasks and as effectively. You can't really sort of share responsibilities, and so to an extent it can be disadvantageous. I would also say there are things that one can gain from being a single delegate. As someone who is obviously directing a General Assembly committee, it's there's somewhat of a burden as if you're a double delegation to make sure that both of your delegates are speaking equitably or sort of equal caliber, I would say, to sort of, so both are contributing in equal amounts, so not one person is overwhelming the rest of them. So you might be at a slight disadvantage in some ways, but also you don't have the burden of sort of having to deal with another person who has to be on the same level as you, say, or that type of situation. So I would say generally the directors will be very cognizant of the fact that you're a single delegate in a double delegation committee, so you should not worry about that too much. Okay, how many signatories are required in a committee like DISEC for a draft resolution to be considered? So I think what I would generally say is about a quarter of the committee, so I would say around 40 signatories, maybe more in some circumstances. It really sort of varies on sort of how many countries are in each committee. DISEC has the most countries, so all UN member states and observer states are basically represented on DISEC, so I would say somewhere between 40 and 60, although I would always make an announcement about that based on what I'm receiving and how things seem to be playing out. So, but it is definitely important to, before you submit a draft resolution, make sure that it has the necessary signatories. Off the top of my head right now, that is the number that I would go with, although that is something that I would make an announcement about in committee. So how should we cite any sort of legal direction? Do you want to clarify exactly what you mean by that? If you mean sort of legal language, then again, wherever you're getting that legal language from, be it some sort of think tank or a policy organization or a non-governmental organization or a governmental organization, you should be referencing where you got it from. So again, no formal footnotes are necessary, but you should definitely be saying sort of along the lines of the United States Department of State's report on etc. XYZ. So you should be definitely making reference to that informally, even though you're not sort of citing it as a footnote. And so then the only double delegation committees are SC and HSC, right? I don't think that's the case. I'm fairly sure that DISEC is a double delegation committee, and I know that a couple of, at least some of the other ECOSOCs are double delegation committees. So the only two specialized agencies that are double delegation committees off the top of my head are HSC and SC, except don't quote me on that. Again, any questions related to sort of the logistics of committees should be directed to info@hmunindia.org, but I'm fairly positive that those are not the only two double delegation committees. Great, so I don't see any more questions, so I guess I'm just going to give a few concluding remarks before ending this webinar. Any other questions that you might have on writing a draft resolution or writing a working paper on the sort of nitty-gritty and formalities involved in clause format, of which there are many, then you can absolutely feel free to email any of your directors, but definitely feel free to email me, and you can email me at DISEC, so DISEC, @hmunindia.org. I'd be happy to answer any questions related to this webinar that you might have as a follow-up. So definitely do that. Okay, I see one more question, so I'll answer one more question. So if the format of our draft resolution has a problem, like a comma, colon problem, would be given a chance to correct it. So what I would say is I would make sure that basically you're structuring it properly. So if there are grammatical mistakes, oftentimes the director will make those changes for you or will ask you to clarify something, but there are such things as unsubstantive questions that HMUN kind of doesn't really do unsubstantive questions, but we will sort of go with that. I was informed that DISEC is a single delegation committee, so I think they're still figuring out the details of that exactly. DISEC might be a single delegation committee. I've been given kind of mixed information on that, but again, any questions specifically related to the details should be directed to info@hmunindia.org. I'm not entirely sure which committees are double delegation and which ones are single delegation, but basically you should know essentially if there are two people from your school who are representing that committee and two people who are, or if there's one person representing, then that basically will say if it's a double delegation committee or a single delegation committee. So just to get back quickly to those concluding remarks, I'm going to sort of stop at taking questions at this point, but please do feel free to email me at disec@hmunindia.org if you have any questions whatsoever. another side point, if anyone is a tennis fan, watch the women's final that is coming up in just less than an hour right now, so fun stuff there. If you have any sort of questions, anyone wants to introduce themselves to me, please go for it. But thank you all for watching the webinar. I'm really sorry again that there are a couple of technical difficulties at the beginning with the microphone. Sometimes things are slightly out of my control and you can follow all instructions and still get it slightly wrong, but thank you for bearing with me on that. And I'm seeing that there's a bit of confusion about single delegation versus double delegation. There is a chance I could be slightly wrong on this. When in doubt, always just email info@hmunindia.org and they should be able to help you on that. So great, thank you all for tuning in, and again, any questions that you might have, please send them my way, and thank you all, and I'll see you very shortly, hopefully all of you, at HMUN India